Fulbright scholar from the Philippines, and she's going to be sharing with us about the Philippines and the Pearl of the Orient. And I'm going to read a little bit about her bio when I introduce her, so y'all will know a little more about her. I know you got to have dinner with her a little bit this morning, or today, but you probably didn't get a chance to ask her a question. Let me read this so y'all kind of know more about her background, and I think it'll be helpful. So, Dr. Amihan April Maya Alcazar, or April is what we call her, is currently the University President of the University of Pasig City, Metro Manila, Philippines. The university has 10 baccalaureate programs and approximately 5,000 students. She is now on a Fulbright Senior Scholarship to conduct advanced research on models of American community colleges for possible adoption in the Philippine higher education sector. It was in high school that she read the book A Long Way Home, written by Santa Rama Rao, an Indian writer from post-World War II, that she wanted to foray into international field. Her field of study is business administration. Go business, love business folks. and she finished her Bachelor of Science in Business Administration cum laude at the University of the Philippines, where she became a member of Phi Kappa Phi in 1989, as well as the Pi Gamma Mu Honor Society. She went on to graduate with a Bachelor's of Law degree from the same university and became a member of the Philippine Bar in 1994. Besides being a university and college scholar, she was an active student leader who wanted to present her country, the Philippines, in a positive light, especially to the world outside. It was also in college that she studied foreign languages, Spanish, Japanese, German, and French. She started with activities utilizing her writing abilities with prizes in the Chilean Writing Contest in Valparaiso, Chile, and Japan Airlines Writing Contest in Tokyo, Japan, while submitting her papers for presentation at the International University Congress in Rome, Italy, and at Pi Gamma Mu Annual Convention held at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama. She went on to take a dual technology degree under the auspices at the International Association of Students in Business and Economics at the University of Bayreuth, Bavaria, in Germany, for 18 months, and spent 6 months as the AIESCC International Headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, as a member of the International Congress auditing team. After becoming a lawyer, she became legal resident agent for international companies who had development projects in the Philippines. She represented principals from the United States, France, Germany, Spain, Switzerland, and Japan, negotiating their contracts and investments in the Philippines. She then went on to study her Master's of Business Administration and Doctorate in Business Administration in Tohoku University for 6 years as a scholar of the Japanese Ministry of Education. She was also a scholar to the Association of Overseas Technical Scholarship under the Japan Patent Office for Intellectual Property and Asian Scholar of the Japan Association of Language Teachers. She was an expert lecturer for the German Academic Exchange Council on Business Analytics in Germany and one of the first presenters of the IBM Big Data Conference, now known as Insight, first held in Las Vegas. She was a part of the mission of Filipino university presidents to Canada researching on community colleges. All throughout her career as a student, lawyer, senior manager, academic, and administrator, she's always let inspired leadership and advocacy for good international relations be her guiding light. As you know from her background, she's got a varied background and has a lot of wisdom to share with us. Tonight, she's going to be sharing with us about the Philippines. And I'd like to introduce y'all to Dr. April Alcazar. Let's welcome her.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction, Dr. Melhorn. So I specifically requested to do this lecture for today because today is June 12. Actually, it's already June 13 in the Philippines because there's a 13-hour difference. So that's why he said, oh, you're going to owe your students big because it's 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning in Manila right now. So basically, today is actually a very commemorative date because it's the 75th anniversary of the Philippine independence from the American colonial government. So we will also be joined by Ms. Milagros Tan. So she's our program officer from Fulbright Philippines. Hello, Ms. Mila. So can you maybe turn on your video? And also, the students that are joining us today represent the 10 academic programs that we have in the University of Pasig City. So where Pasig City is located, we are in Metro Manila. So Manila is actually the capital of the Philippines, and we are the second oldest district in the capital region. So we are 5,000 students for these 10 baccalaureate degree programs, and we are a city university fully funded by the city government of Pasig City and considered as one of the departments of the city itself. So I'm here in UT Martin, actually, on the Fulbright Senior Scholarship Program. So the Fulbright Philippines had granted to me through the Philippine Association of Educational Foundation this grant to conduct a research on the community colleges model, because as yet they don't exist in the Philippines. And we've actually started these studies from 5 years back, and we've also done the studies also in Canada. But I won't be doing this boring lecture about the research for tonight. That's going to be reserved for the graduate class in education, where I'll be conducting the lecture about the research. So today, because this is also in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright Scholarship, so this year, 2021, is also very memorable for us because of the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright. So I first came to Fulbright actually 10 years ago, but I had to decline the fellowship at the time because then I became university president. So I've been the university president for the last 10 consecutive school years. So you can imagine that there's a lot of like good memories, and I feel like this is kind of like my capstone research project to go back to school as a student. So one of the best souvenirs that I think I'll take back from UTM is this ID card that they issued to me that says student, right? Yeah, so, right? So, and today, so what we're gonna do, we're gonna make it the lecture not the millennial style. So because I specifically wanted to talk to the governor's school students. And I think it's a very important work to do because the high schools are going to be the feeder school to the students in UTM. And so that's one of the particular missions that you're actually doing in higher education, is actually to identify who are the potential students who will prospectively benefit from the academic programs that are being offered in higher education. Also because we are a city university, so we're very much tied up to the activities that we do in the city. And of course, in the last 8 years, last year excepting, normally on this day, I will have to wake up at the ungodly hour of 5 in the morning because there would always be a 7 o'clock wreath laying and flag raising ceremony on this particular day. So instead, I decided, okay, let's have a lecture, right? And let the students wake up this early. So today I requested them to be in their Philippine costumes. So I'll explain all of that more later on. And then I also requested 2 of your college counselors to give a surprise, okay? So later you'll find out. And I've also requested Dr. Melhorn to identify some promising students that we have from the governor's school, and of course the UTM college counselors to represent the brain power of UTM, right? You want to recruit the governor's school students to come back to UTM. And so we will start and have a game in order for us to know more about the Philippines. So my lecture is going to be about the Philippines, Pearl of the Orient. That's the title of my lecture. And I have to explain a little bit why. And literally, I had to cross an ocean to come here. It takes 13 hours from Manila to Los Angeles. And then you know how far it is from Los Angeles to Nashville. So yeah, it took me like 24 hours before I can crash from the trip, right? So everything that we're discussing has something to do with water. So when you think about the Philippines, you're literally going to think about water. So when I talk about Pearl of the Orient, so as you know, pearls, you have to dive down. You have to really get it out of the oyster to see the beauty of the pearl. And the Orient is, of course, what we refer to in the Far East. That's the Asia-Pacific region. And so we actually are identified as the Pearl of the Orient. So you know about pearls, you actually have to dive deep down in order to explore and really get to the pearl to see the beauty. And I think that's the same metaphor for my country, that you really have to explore the country in order to see the beauty of the country, the scenic scenery, as well as the spirit of the people. And so I'm going to start with, of course, asking our governor school. So in this corner, let's ask the team members. So I've named the team, and I'll explain why. So they're going to be called Team Coro. And coro is a Spanish word that means chorus. And so this is going to be your emblem. So again, as I said, everything to do with water. So you have here, it says here, Shell Concert, right? So this is going to be your emblem for tonight. And you're going to be known as the Mariners, okay? Because you all have this practice here in the United States. You have the sports team, and you always give nicknames to all of your teams, right? So you're going to be the Mariners for tonight, okay? So on the left corner, we have Team Galleon. That's the UTM brain power, I hope. Yeah. And they're going to be called Team Galleon. So are all of you ag students? Right, okay. So, and that's why we have the Governor's School for Agriculture here. So, you know, it's really like contending teams here. So, and I have to give you like a surprise because I chose this day, and it's supposed to be the 75th anniversary of the Independence Day of the Philippines, but the proclamation of independence from American colonial government did not happen today, actually. So that's the $1 million question, right? So when did it actually occur, right? So we're going to find out the answer to that question by the very end of this lecture, okay? So that's why you have to stick around for this lecture. Okay, so how does this work now? Okay. So actually, what happened was that, okay, we have to show this. Can we ask here? Okay, can I show that so that it's a screen? Okay. So actually, what happened was that the declaration was actually done on the 4th of July, 1946. That's why here you have on microfilm this newspaper that says President Truman, right? He was the president at the time, and they declared independence in 1946. So why did they actually have to eventually have the anniversary commemorated on June 12? Okay, so now we're going to start our game. And so I'm sure you remember what this game is, Who's Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? So I think our Governor's School students are not that far away from 5th grade, right? And all of the questions, so here are the mechanics. So all of the questions have been approved, right? Based on the curriculum of the 5th grade by the Tennessee Board of Education. So if you don't know the answers to this question, I think it's time to hit the books, right? And just like an exam, you have 3 levels: easy, medium difficult, and difficult. 3 categories. So we have geography, world history, and American history. So you'll have 9 questions, 2 for geography, 2 for world history, and 5 for American history. And all of the questions are related to the United States, the Philippines, and the state of Tennessee. Okay, so that should give you enough clue, right? Right? Is that enough clue? And of course, last tip, you should know this. This is a test-taking technique, right? It's all multiple choice. So when you have a multiple choice question, what do? You eliminate the 2 least answers, right? And then you flip a coin, right, with the remaining 2 answers. So that's game theory, right? Okay, so let's see. Let's Lexi, Mackenzie, Katie, Maddox, Jimmy, and Noah. So your team Coro, and you have a chorus here. Then there's Michaela, Taylor, Kelsey. Who are the other members of the UTM?
They are dressed up.
Ah, okay. There's Matthew, there's Amanda, and there's another. There should be another one.
There's Kelsey.
He's not here.
Okay, so you're 5 to 6, right? Okay, you can handle this. Right? Okay, so I think we're ready, and there are 9 questions, so we have a built-in tiebreaker here, but we have to go through like all the questions, okay? Because that's what the lecture is going to be all about. Okay, so first question, so this is geography, right? Okay, this is geography, okay? So the closer one gets to the equator, the blank it gets, right? So is it hotter? Is it colder? Is it cooler? Or is it warmer? Right? So judge, who has the first answer?
Scholars, let's start with you.
Governor School?
Come on, Coral.
Team Coral? Mariners and the Pirates? So, okay. Okay, so yeah, your answer is D. Okay, and how about our Pirates? What do you say? Right?
Okay, they're going to say D as well. Both
Really?
of them say D?
Really? So warmer, okay? Do you remember like what the equator is? What is it? Do you remember what the equator is, Lexi? Right, so, okay. So I'll have to reveal the answer and explain what is the answer, right? So it's actually hotter, right? So, and why? Okay, why is it that way? So, Michaela, isn't math your favorite subject? No? No? Okay, so I'm going to give you a tip on how to convert from Fahrenheit to Celsius, okay? Because the United States, you might know this, is one of the few remaining countries that still use the English system for measurement, right? So you start with 90 degrees Fahrenheit, then 90 minus 30, 60, then you divide it by 2, it's 30, right? So when you talk about like qualitative descriptions is this actually, when you say hotter, so 30 to 40 degrees centigrades or 90 to 110 Fahrenheit would be the average temperature in the Philippines. Because, yes, because the equator is that invisible band that goes around the Earth, right? And so the closer you are to the equator, the hotter it gets because it's equidistant from the northern to the southern hemisphere, right? And the Philippines is a little bit to the north of the equator. So if you talk about the temperature, so if you start with like 90 degrees, so when you talk about it being warmer actually in the Philippines, for us, it's going to be from 70 to 89. So that's warm for us, right? And then if you talk about cooler, so that's going to be like from 50 to 69 degrees. And that's probably the coldest that it will ever get in the Philippines, right? Because if it's cold, if it's like 30 to 49 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll never be the temperature in the Philippines, never, right? So because it's a tropical country. So here's the map of where we're at. We are in the Asia-Pacific region, and this is Southeast Asia. So as you can see, the equator runs through Indonesia. So it will be hotter in Indonesia. They normally, in Indonesia, they would have like 100 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That's average temperatures in Indonesia. So we're a little to the north, right? And so that's tropical marine because we're surrounded by water. So that's why I said when you talk about the Philippines, it's very much geography is your destiny because we're all surrounded by water. So there's a lot of influence about the water in the Philippines. And so that's why I gave you this shell because it's really reminiscent of like the ocean and the sea, and the galleon is a ship. So later I'll explain to you what's the significance of why we talk about chorus and we talk about the galleon. Okay, so 0 by far, Judge. Okay, 0, 0. Okay, next. So again, on geography. So what is the geographical formation known as an archipelago? Again, think water, right? Is it a group of rivers, a group of small islands, a group of atolls, or a group of lagoons? Okay? So UTM, yeah. Pirates. First shot, Pirates.
B, they say B.
Okay, B. Okay. 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 And then we're going to call out the surprise after the geography. Okay? So it's a group of, yes. So 1, so it's a group of small islands. So as you can see from the map earlier, so we are an archipelago, so there's 7,101 islands. So the only other country that has more islands in the Southeast Asian region would be Indonesia. They have 30,000 islands, right? So anywhere, it's not very far away from any body of water. So that's why when I talked about small islands, so a specific kind of island is an atoll. So that's a specific kind of island because you have corals that ring a lagoon. And a lagoon is a seawater that's ringed by this atoll. So you know, you've heard about the Bikini Atoll, right? Where they do the nuclear explosions from the French government. But that's a specific island. So it's not necessarily an atoll when you have the archipelago in the Philippines. So the reason why I discuss this geography is because it really informs us about what influences a lot of the political, the significance of like the Philippines, because it's in a very strategic position in the Asia-Pacific region, and why there was a lot of attraction for other countries to come to the Philippines because of its location, and also the influence of climate, the geographical characteristics of the country, okay? So I'm gonna call in our college counselor because I'm also going to explain why they are dressed up today. Hello. So Matthew, okay, and Samantha, come on down. Hello. A little clap for them, I think. Hello. Okay. So I asked them to come dressed in, okay, don't lose it. You're on camera, Matthew, okay? So as I was explaining about geography, so the first inhabitants in the Philippines were the so-called like Aitas, which we all know everyone actually originated from Africa, right? So when they first came to the landmass, so they were very short and dark-skinned. But the second inhabitants that came to the Philippines were from Indonesia. So they were seafarers. So what Matthew is wearing is a typical costume from the southern Philippines. It's very near Indonesia. So you see Indonesia's just over there to the south. Don't lose it. Okay. So it's called a malong, and it's very similar to what they wear in Indonesia, which is a sar, because it's a long tubular cloth, usually made of cotton. So it's very cool. As I said, it's hot. So you can't. Yeah, right? through there, right? And it's worn both by men and women, right? So very practical, right? And then let's get over to Samantha. Let's do some fancy pageant walking here, Samantha. Okay, right? So what she's wearing, also from the southern Philippines, is the third inhabitants who settled in the Philippines were from Malaysia. So you can see like Malaysia. But by the time the Malaysians came to the Philippines, they were already converted to Islam, to the Muslim faith. So this costume is kind of similar of what they would have in like Pakistan, for example. So it's loose pantaloons, and they could also be worn by both men and women. So they were kind of like androgynous fashion, okay? So, and so you have, and I asked them, to give this fashion show because I asked our students to wear a different kind of costume. So I'll explain their costumes later on because now we have what we call Filipiniana. So when we have like these special occasions and then we say, wear Filipiniana. So it could be this, which is like influenced by the southern Philippines. And then the other I will explain in the next question. Thank you, Samantha and Matthew. So maybe you can take pictures later, okay? Thank you. Okay, so that's one-on-one. So now we're gonna get to the next world history. So now we're in the intermediate part, okay? So next question. As Christopher Columbus officially set foot in the Americas on October 12, 1492 for Spain, so this explorer claimed the Philippines on March 16, 1521 for the Spanish crown. Okay, so I've got a hint here. There's a corner in the Skyhawk Dining Hall named after him. Okay, Judge?
All right, this time we're going with scholars first.
Okay. Have you been to
Okay.
the Skyhawk Dining Hall?
No cheating.
Have the scholars gone to the Skyhawk Dining Hall?
Okay.
That's your hint.
Okay. D, you'll
Right.
go with William.
Okay. UTM team. Yeah. Okay. Mariners, okay. What can you say, Lexi? B. So Ferdinand Magellan and counselors, pirates? B. Okay. So what's the right answer? So, yes. So that's Ferdinand Magellan. So there's Magellan's Corner in the Skyhawk Dining Hall. They really have great vegetarian options. Okay. And so one of the main attractions for the European settlers to come to the east of Europe were to look for spices, right? Because in Europe, they had difficulty in preserving their food. So they were looking for like these spices that could preserve food for them. So that was like one of the main attractions. So all of the people that I've mentioned in the multiple choices were actually explorers, so European explorers. So Vasco da Gama, of course, was the most famous Portuguese explorer who was the first who actually traveled from Europe, from Portugal, to India. So that's why you have the Portuguese influenced city of Goa in India. And eventually, they also settled in Macau, which is now part of China. But they had like this lease from China. So that's Vasco da Gama. And Ferdinand Magellan was also from Portugal. But he was eventually commissioned by the Spanish crown to circumnavigate the world and find a westward route going to the East Indies. So that's why in Chile, there's a so-called Strait of Magellan named after him, which is the natural sea passage between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So he did come to the Philippines in 1521, but he was killed by a local chieftain named Lapu-Lapu. So he is known as the first Filipino hero who rallied against the colonizers. So when I asked our students, so you can see our students here, so when the kind of Filipiniana costume that they're wearing is the Spanish influence Filipiniana costume, because the Philippines was colonized by Spain for 350 years. So there's continuing influence from Spain. So for the men, for example, this would be the barong Tagalog. So the most expensive would be made of pineapple fibers. Then it's also very cool still because it's hot, right? And then for the ladies, so they would have a Maria Clara. So it's very typical of Spanish influence costumes that are modest. So it's a long gown that they wear and it's all covered up. So that's why they say when we were colonized under Spain, we were 350 years in a convent because they also brought Roman Catholicism to the Philippines. And so the Philippines is the only Asian countries that's majority Catholic. So around 80% of the people of the Philippines profess their faith to be Roman Catholic. And then as I've mentioned about the southern Philippines, they had remained mostly Muslim. So there's a separate region that is Muslim Mindanao. So because they practice the Islamic faith. Okay? So when I talk about the galleon, so that was like in history, that was an influence of Spain. So these were seafaring ships. And so the other explorers, for example, Juan Sebastian del Cano, so after Magellan died, he continued with the expedition and eventually ended up with 3 ships back to Spain. So it was the first time that they had circumnavigated the world at the time. And Francis Xavier is one of the co-founders of the Congregation of the Society of Jesus. So you know the present Pope, he's Pope Francis because he's named, he's a Jesuit for one thing, and so he's named after the co-founder of the Society of Jesus, okay? So back to world history. So this is Ferdinand Magellan. They don't have the picture in the Skyhawk Dining Hall, okay? So here, again, world history, okay? So that's the next question. What was the doctrine that dominated the economic system of the 16th century, okay? So think 16th century. So they're exploring, they're going around the world, right? Was it A, colonialism, B, alchemy, C, mercantilism, or D, manifest destiny? Okay. Counselors? C. Okay. And how about the mariners? What say you, scholars? Well, okay, mercantilism. Okay, so let's see. So what's the score so far, Judge? Okay, it's really, nail biting, right? So we have mercantilism, right? So what is mercantilism? Okay, so we backtrack a little bit. We were talking about the expeditions, right? So at first, during the Middle Ages, so that's the medieval times, they were trying to find how can we get gold. That's what they really wanted. They were trying to convert base metals. Of course, we know that it's not possible, right, to convert gold. And so they were thinking, okay, like how can we find gold? So eventually, in the Treaty of Tordesillas, the world was actually divided through the intercession of the Pope between the Spanish and the Portuguese. So that's why in South America, you will have that part of South America that was Spanish colonies, and then eventually Brazil was in the Portuguese side, right? So that's when they started the colonialism. So that's the policy of subjugating one people in order to gain economic dominance. So when Spain became the colonizer of South America, so they started to extract from the gold and the silver mines. And so the galleon trade from Acapulco to Manila was where they loaded all of these silver and golds and the metals. And it traveled all the way through the Pacific from Acapulco in Mexico to the Philippines, because the Philippines is strategically located very near China. And the Chinese were even trading with the Philippines before the Spaniards came. So this is the trade that they were trading in spices, silk, gunpowder. So this galleon trade was a kind of investment for the businessmen from Spain, and they could recover a lot of their investments through this trade. But eventually you had all of these pirates. That's why I said pirates, right? Who were attacking the galleon trades, and it didn't prove to be sustainable. So eventually they had to stop the galleon trade. Now, manifest destiny is a little bit like separate from this doctrine because it came much later after the European colonizer came to the Americas. And so when there was a doctrine that was developed in the United States who wanted to repel European colonialism in the Americas, then you had this nexus of principles, which is the manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine in around 1845, wherein the dominance and the expansion was for the North American expansion here. So that's the reason why all of these doctrines are similarly situated and linked to each other, okay? So we have 3-3, Judge, right? Okay, so now we're getting to the difficult category, American history, right? So flex your muscles now. And so all of these questions have relation to the United States, to the Philippines, and to the state of Tennessee. Okay, so right, okay, so now we're getting to the first question. Who was the American military leader who oversaw the military forces in the Pacific in the battle against the Japanese in World War II, right? So was it General Arthur MacArthur? Was it General George Marshall? Was it General Douglas MacArthur or General George Patton? Okay. Yeah. Do we have Georges? We have Arthurs, MacArthurs? Which one? C. General Douglas MacArthur. Pirates? Okay, so are we making a breakthrough here? Right, so that's General Douglas MacArthur, right? Yeah. So he was the Supreme Allied Commander of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, right? And he commanded 90,000 troops of American and Filipino forces. So because the Philippines was a colony at the time of the United States, so they joined forces to repel the Japanese. General Arthur MacArthur was his father. So General Arthur MacArthur was the first military governor general of the Philippines in 1901. But he later had a conflict with the future president of the United States, so he quit his job as military governor general, but he was famous for leading 50,000 soldiers in the Battle of Missionary Ridge, east of Chattanooga, for the Union troops, and that was basically the nail in the coffin of the Confederacy, that particular battle. So that was General Arthur MacArthur. So of course, General George Marshall was known for the European Recovery Program. He was one of the generals in Europe and then eventually became Secretary of State and Defense under President Truman, while General George Patton was the military leader that led in the Mediterranean theater in World War II and eventually the Allied invasion in Normandy, France. So those are your military leaders. Okay, so 4-4. Okay, so we're getting really into a tough race here. So here, maybe this will break the ice. He was the Governor General of the Philippines in 1902 and later became the 27th President of the United States of America in 1908. Was it William McKinley? Was it William Howard Taft? Was it Theodore Roosevelt? Or was it Warren Harding? Okay. Right. So will this break the bank? Let's see. Okay. Right?
We're going to go see.
You're going to go see Theodore Roosevelt, okay? Mariners. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Contributions from the scholars. Yeah. Maddox.
No, you cannot phone friends.
Okay. No cheating. Okay. Okay. D, you'll go with William Harding. Okay. What do you think? Judge, have a clue?
I don't have a clue.
Yeah? Who has a clue? Right? Okay. So what's the right answer? Oh, why? So he was the president, okay? Yeah, okay. So he was the president who became the 27th president and became the 10th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So the only one who had both positions. So before he became president, he was the Governor General of the Philippines, right? And he was the one who quarreled with General Arthur MacArthur because he took over the position. So in Manila, there's a main thoroughfare that's called Taft Avenue that runs through the city, right? So Theodore Roosevelt was actually, before he became president, so he led the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War, right? So he was ahead of William Howard Taft. And then you have William McKinley. So he was the president at the time when there were negotiations during the Spanish-American War in 1898. And Warren Harding was the 29th president and the only sitting senator who eventually became president, right? So who was the 28th? Woodrow Wilson, okay? So he's not in the answers, okay? So 4-4, okay? So we're getting there. So this is William Howard Taft. Okay, next. So I was talking about the Spanish-American War, right? So as a result of the Spanish-American War, the following territories were ceded by Spain to the United States for $20 million, right? So were they Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guyana, and the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Philippines. You know how to design this kind of multiple choice questions, right? Scholars. B. B would be Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. How about the pirates? What say you? B. Okay, so let's see. Okay. So Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, right? So Puerto Rico, as we know, is still a Commonwealth of the United States, right? And Guam is a territory of the United States located in the South Pacific, and the Philippines was the only one that was granted independence eventually of these territories that were ceded. So the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that they were to be unincorporated territories. So U.S. Constitution would not apply to these territories. So Cuba was not ceded. So the title to Cuba was relinquished by Spain to the United States, and eventually Cuba was granted a nominal independence in 1902. So that's the difference between ceding and relinquishing. So next, so these are the three territories. Okay, now, okay, this one's remember this difficult, last two questions, difficult, right? So one of the effects of colonization is that the colonizer can probably like impose a lot of it, like culture and systems. But on the other hand, there's also a possible exchange where the colonizers take on some of the characteristics of the colonized country. So here there's a word in the English language which is derived from the Tagalog-Filipino language. And so is it boonies? Is it bondocs? Is it bugalo? Or is it bagas? Yeah? B, okay, bondocs. Okay, let's see. Mariners. A huddle here, okay. Yeah. They're thinking. Go with B, okay? So let's see, okay? Any idea about the meanings of these words? Sort of, right? Okay. So it's bondocs, right? So rural, remote area is bondocs, right? So there's a word in Tagalog called bundok, and that's what I took it from. Boonies is just the abbreviation of bondocs. So a bugalo is a fast dance of Afro-American origin, so it's not. While bagas is that dry pulpy material that you get from sugarcane. It's originally from Cuba, although we had sugarcane plantations in the Philippines. They had more sugarcane in Cuba compared to the Philippines, so they borrowed that word from Cuba. Okay, so it's 5? Oh, wow, okay, it's tough, right? Okay. Okay, so this is it. This is like the tiebreaker, right? So this was the military ship which supported the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines, which was the landing site to liberate the Asia Pacific from the Japanese. So was it the USS Maine, the USS Nashville, the USS Tennessee, or the USS Arizona? Right? Yeah, so this is the last one. This is the last question. Yeah, scholars? C. You have the USS Tennessee. Okay, what say you pirates? UTM? C? Okay, and why do you think that? Just because I gave you the hint that it has to be like Tennessee? Okay, so it's the USS Tennessee, right? So the reason is because this was a very important landing that's always commemorated also in the Philippines, because General Douglas MacArthur made good his promise, I shall return. And so he did on board the USS Tennessee. So the USS Maine was the ship that was actually sunk in Havana Harbor that catapulted the Spanish-American War. So it's kind of like different. While the USS Nashville was the gunboat that fired against the Spanish during the Spanish-American War. And the USS Arizona was the boat that was sunk by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor. So, yeah, so it's different. So judge what's going to happen. Yeah, tough one, right?
If we're arm wrestling, I got this. Samantha, come over here.
You have to do arm wrestling, right? So he's the winner. Okay. So, but don't worry. Okay. So for both teams, so don't worry. We'll have, of course, the prize commodities of the Philippines. You have bananas, you have mangoes, and you have this special buttery nut. So both teams will get their prizes. Okay. Yeah. So thank you. Okay. Yeah. Were you? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I think, yeah, so what they were trying to prove was, you know, you should come to UTM, right, scholars, at the end of this 1 month immersive program, okay? So thank you so much for your participation. So now I'm going to get to the other slides. Okay. So when I was actually talking about like the participation of students, right? Of course, and why I specifically wanted to have an audience of the governor's schools, so I guess I have to kind of like get back to my own experience, right? So 1991, so how far away was that, right? Do I still look the same? Yeah, so I think basically really the experiences that inform you when you're, you know, between 0 and 20 are really the most memorable, impressionable, and maybe the life-defining moments for you. And I think for me, like one of those life-defining moments was really like when I went away from home and did my dual tech program in Germany. So of course, this was like part of an association, and that's why when I go like, why is it Team Coro? Because you're coming from different high schools for now, right? And still you're kind of melding together in this immersive experience. So one of the courses that I teach in the MBA program, of course, is strategy and Asian business systems and international business. So you're not really yet a part of an organization. You're just trying to find a voice, and so you're having a chorus. You're trying to find this commonality among the members of this particular scholars group, whereas Team Galleon, it's a ship. They're already a part of an organization. This is the university, right? So you have a hierarchy here in the university. You have the captain of the ship, Dr. Carver, over there, right? And so there's a hierarchy about the roles and responsibilities that happens in a ship, right? And so that's part of like what this whole process is for identifying potential and honing leadership skills. So I think that also started a lot for me, right? That whole leadership skill training really started from way back in high school, college, and then eventually as a professional. So that's very important that this period of time when you have this experiential learning here in UTM is an opportunity for you to get ahead of your future. This is part of your early post-secondary opportunities that are available here in the state of Tennessee, right? You're gonna get advanced placement, you're gonna do the 6 units credits, right, for the governor's school. And so definitely this is like one of the possibly most influential experiences that you've had. Our counselors here, almost all of them came from the governor's school previously, right? And that was like a bridge that they traversed in order for them to eventually make that decision to pursue the course of study that they're having right now, which is agriculture. So I think that's very important for students to have this immersive experiential learning early on. And I specifically also remember that most of those foreign languages that I studied them before I was 20 years old. So even if I didn't like have a lot of practice for it, eventually it still comes back to me because your mind is like at its peak until you're 25 years old. So one of the first faculty members that I met first came on the first day of school in UTM, Dr. Donald Cho. Hello, Donald, he's there. So he discussed with me his research about neurochemical transmitters in the brain and why it has an effect on epileptic seizures. So that's kind of like have a personal interest to me because I have a child with autism. So definitely, you know, you have this neuroplasticity in your brain that if you just extend it a little bit when you're that young, it's possible that you have a lot of potential to absorb as much as you can. So since that time, Donald, then I have a new interest. Like I'm always like trying to find the books in the library about neuroscience and, you know, sleeping late because apparently these neuroscientists have all of these YouTube videos about their experiments, right? Yeah. So that's, I think, one of the most good opportunities for our scholars to really be involved. And that's the same also that I would say to our own students, right? Because whatever spark of interest that could be given to them during this period of time, which is really like impressionable, take it in. It's like osmosis. That it will eventually have an influence on you. If your brain is a data bank, you just fill it up. Doesn't matter if it's actually going to be useful or worthwhile at that period of time, because eventually this knowledge will have its use eventually when you need it. You can pull it out of your hat, right? So, and then eventually, again, that same year, so again, I looked at the Asia-Pacific region. So where am I coming from, right? The Asia-Pacific region, and I think early on with this interaction that I had with fellow students at the time, it's very important because now the Asia-Pacific region is kind of like the developing area in the world. It has the world's most population, really is located in the Asia-Pacific region. So we're like in the middle of all of these developments, you know, the mega cities. Manila is actually a city of 13 million people, if you can imagine that, right? So don't worry, I've been in places even smaller than Martin. I lived in Bayreuth, which is a town of 35,000 people, okay? But can you imagine like the scale and the magnitude of moving like 13 million people? And there are those megacities, most of them are located in the Asia-Pacific region. So that's a region that has a possible impact in the next century. So, and one of the things that I'm doing with UTM in the United States is really to initiate this possible collaboration and partnerships with academic institutions. So hopefully we have an innovative partnership with the Philippines to begin with. So I heard, Dr. Carver, that the Dean's Council have a resolution to go away in winter, right? Because I suggested to them that they could get away from the cold weather in January, right? Exactly, right? No, but who's going to keep house? Right, so here, 1992, so again, I was talking about like this experience with global interaction. And so this like in 1992, I went to Germany just 3 months after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's a very historic time. And so again, there was an opening in Eastern Europe during this period of time because, for example, 1991, Slovenia just became independent. Then you had the breaking of the Czech Republic with Slovakia, but I still went there when it was Czechoslovakia. Then January 1991, I was in Yugoslavia the month before the war broke out. So this was a very historic time, really. And you can say that when you have these shifts in world history, what happens is you actually want to be, if not a participant, then an active spectator in trying to see where all of these changes and developments are happening in order to see what impact it could potentially have on you. So I remember this particular time because Hungary was the most progressive among the former Eastern European countries in opening up its economy. That's why we had the Congress there, because the Hungarian government gave it support for an international Congress of Students to be held there for the first time. Then here, again, I go back, and I called it Czechoslovakia because it was still, at that time, Czechoslovakia. So who was the president? It was Václav Havel, who led 1968 Velvet Revolution in the Czechoslovakia at the time. And again, this participation, by this time I was already a law student, so there was a lot of interest that I had in like political activities. And so that was part of it, the comparison between what had happened in the Philippines in 1986 with the People Power Revolution. And that time I was a freshman in college when I participated in that student activist movement against the then dictatorship. And so that's also part of the role of the young people, to be agents of change, possibly to participate in what is happening in societal change. And I think there's a call up until this time for young people to be involved in changing society. Then here you had, like, of course, as I said, for me, one possible way that I was able to gain all of this experience was through my academic activity. So obviously I was very much involved, not just in my academic studies, but outside of the academic studies, to really find venues where these ideas, concepts, and ideas can find traction. And part of that is really having the ability to communicate. And I would have to say that you would be fortunate because you will have English as a native language. The rest of the world would want to learn English, right? And so there were always these opportunities for international youth congresses to present different forms of academic papers or have academic activities to meet other students or scholars who were studying specific topics. So at that time, my interest was about human rights. So obviously, Sweden is very much in that space. They have the Nobel Prizes, where they would want to encourage students who had that interest. Here, eventually, as mentioned by Dr. Melhorn earlier, so eventually, there's a period of time when I did shift to become a practitioner, a professional. But then I decided I wanted to go back to the academe because I think it was a metamorphosis personally for me, from student activist to advocate. And eventually I saw like education is really part of what we needed to do in order to ensure the sustainability of the change that we would like to happen. So I went back to graduate school. And so this was my cohort with the Japanese Ministry of Education. So as you know, we were also colonized by Japan for 4 years during World War II. And so there is still a strong linkage between the Philippines and Japan, but mainly because of the economic influence in Japan. So Japan, at a certain point in time, was the second largest economy, and definitely in the Asia-Pacific region was the largest trading partner of most Asia-Pacific countries, the Philippines included. So there was a lot that could be learned, especially from the Asia-Pacific region in Japan. So this was my cohort. We started 18, I believe. And so by 2006, when I had finished my doctoral degree, so we were only 4 of that 18. So yeah, so that time, of course, obviously, after my graduation from doctoral studies, then I would go to the academe, right, and start teaching. So my first teaching position was actually to teach quantitative methods. So Mackenzie, is math your favorite subject?
No, ma'am, it is not.
No, right? So my goal every semester was to make sure that my students would, at the beginning of the semester, hate math, would love it at the end of the semester. So that was my learning. Yes, so that was my learning objective, right? And of the 2 administrators that I invited to today's lecture, so one is the Director of Student Affairs, so he normally teaches social sciences, history, and philosophy, right? The other one is the department head of our engineering and electronics and communications engineering. So one doesn't like math, the other one doesn't like history. So I said no, by the end of this session, we would at least find these fields of study tolerable, right? So it means that if you just expose yourself early enough to these subjects, eventually you would know that you both are actually necessary for your studies. Then this one, I wanted to get this picture because this was in Kokura University, so by this time I was already teaching, and I was doing a lecture tour in Japan. And why this particular place? Nobody has heard of this place, right? And to me, every time I go to any place, I always want to find what's the specific history of that place. So where I was born is the city where I am right now, Pasig City. But before it became a city, it was a very small town beside the river. So we used to be able to like fish and play but it's completely transformed in my lifetime, right? So everywhere that I go, I'm very much curious about where this particular place is located and his historical significance. There is always. So this particular small town in Japan apparently was to have been the target, actually, of the first atomic bomb that was dropped. And the only reason why it was not dropped there, and it was dropped in Hiroshima, because there was a cloud that was overhang. So zero visibility for the pilots, right? So they had to move the target because there were these munitions companies located there in this place called Kokura. And here in Tennessee, of course, I went to Oak Ridge, right? So you must know about Oak Ridge, where the atomic bomb was actually manufactured, right? So that, there you go, state of Tennessee. And then here, my university in Japan is the place where the March 11, 2011 tsunami hit. So definitely they had to suspend and close the university for 3 months after that, right? So they had the triple threat. I was supposed to go and give a lecture on March 18, 2011, the week after it hit. So fortunately, I wasn't there, right? Didn't become a victim. So instead, what happened is that I did still go to Japan and instead went to the recovery efforts instead. So again, these are some of the many events that you could actually become a participant in, right? And if you're in that space, and if you have all of these contacts, then there's that possibility. Again, I mentioned about the dual technology. So this is one of the things that we visited because UTM has just actually collaborated with the Tennessee College of Applied Technology in Crump to have a 1+3 program. And I was wanting to see that, if that had some similarity with the dual technology programs that they have had in Germany for the longest time, right? And basically, the difference would be that all of the conceptual framework would be taken up first and then eventually applied if you did the American model, whereas in the German model, even as I've experienced it, it's like 35 hours of the week would be devoted to training with the company or the industry, and only 5 to 10 hours will be with the classes or the mentoring by the professor. So that's the difference here. And so eventually, they wanted to identify whether the ASEAN region, the Philippines included, so this would be the 10 member countries of the Southeast Asian countries, would be ready for the dual technology model. So the conclusion was that it would not be ready for that because if substantial investments will have to be made by companies in order for the students to be skilled in the competencies that are of industry standards. So that's why they said it would not be. So we were in an expert seminar for this. And yes, one of the things that I also became involved in was to invite educators to the Philippines in an organization called Teachers Helping Teachers, because we wanted to actually initiate teachers training programs for basic education. So this was prior to the development of eventually introducing K-12 in the Philippines. So it was only in 2013 that we passed a law that put into place the K-12 system. So previously, we only had a 10-year basic education system. So we were one of only 2 remaining countries in the world at the time, the other being Angola, that only had a 10-year basic educational system. So now, our students now in the University of Pasig City will be the first cohort who will graduate this coming school year to have graduated from grade 12. So the last 10 years have really seen unprecedented changes and reforms in the Philippine educational system since the American colonial government put into place the mass education system and institutionalized English as a medium of instruction. So you can imagine the kind of reforms that need to be undertaken by the education sector in the Philippines. Then here, wanted to talk about Korea because I invited my 16-year-old daughter, so the scholars are around this time, to this lecture, and she goes like, what, 8 o'clock in the morning? Of course, you're like 16 years old. You don't want to listen to your mother, right? No. But apparently 3 hours from now, there's going to be a BTS online concert, right? So I gave this lecture in South Korea before all of this Hallyu, the Korean wave, and the worldwide phenomena. And they wanted me to talk about how to become globally competitive students. They wanted me to give a lecture to the Korean students, right? Because that was like part of what they had to aspire to. That's sort of like what they were thinking of in Korea. And so one of the things that I was saying is like, this particular college was located in the middle of Korea, in the former capital during the Shilla dynasty. So this was like the ancient dynasty of Korea. So they are not in Seoul, they're not in the capital, they're not in the city, and yet they were thinking like, how could we become globally competitive? So they had a school for those who would be working in the airline industry, right? So all of that, hospitality management and the ancillary services. So they were thinking, yeah, what we need is like more English language proficiency, more immersion and familiarization with foreign culture, because they were trying to put their students towards the hospitality management or the hospitality industry. So I think that's part of like when you think about like particular countries, you have to think like, what are the aspirations of this particular country? How do they think about the right to self-determination, right? Then finally, here, how did I come to Tennessee, right? So my first affiliation with the University of Tennessee started in 2014. And why was that? Because the Tennessee Renewable Energy and Economic Development Council was established in 2008 by then UT President Joe Johnson, because there were all of these incentives for renewable energies. And why did they identify the Philippines? Why they wanted to have an international exchange program? Because the Philippines has one of the highest costs of electricity in the Asia-Pacific region, because we have to import all the fossil fuels, and we don't have other sources other than natural gas, but there hasn't been like exploration of natural gas in the Philippines. So why they came to us, and specifically to me, because that time I was the president of the Philippine Association of Extension Program Implementers. This is like an association of higher education institutions whose goal is to utilize educational expertise to benefit the community. So we would go to like the community for outreach activities, and definitely raising consciousness about renewable energies was like what we wanted to promote. And so we came to Tennessee, and for a month-long visit, so we traversed the whole state. I think it was said that we had 10,000 miles on the odometer all across the state of Tennessee. So definitely, of course, there was Nashville and Memphis, of course, but also went to Doctown, very small town where they had the copper mines, and then you had Kingstown, where the mayor said that this is the town with the most number of churches. Okay, really? Okay, being the Bible Belt. So that was like the familiarity that I had in Tennessee, and why I came and wanted to be in UTM, Dr. Carver. So he has become the honorary chairman of the Tennessee Renewable Energy and Economic Development Council. So that's the reason why I'm in Martin, right? So, and then here, again, I was talking about this Association of Southeast Asian Countries. So now what we've done in our Southeast Asian region is that we have an association actually of 10 member countries. So the original members were Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore when it was started in 1975. And then eventually, we had the new members, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Brunei. So that's why it's 10 member countries, and there are 600 million in this ASEAN 10 member countries. So the objective really is to form a free trade area in the region. So there's a lot of interaction and mobility that we want to have. So in 2016, related to education, the Philippines became signatory to the so-called ASEAN Qualifications Reference Framework because we wanted to have like a common credentialing system among the educational systems in these 10 member countries with the goal of eventually having mobility of labor within the region. So it's 600 million people in this area. And so that was like one of those trips that we had in Hue, Vietnam. So Vietnam is like one of the fast developing countries in the Southeast Asian region from the ashes of the war. So it's definitely made a lot of inroads since that time. Then here, if you remember, Samantha, what Matthew was wearing, right? So here's Indonesia. So you can see like well, this is like normal for like the Indonesians, right? So Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country, but it's a multicultural, multi-ethnic country. So you would have some who would be Muslims, or they would be stricter, or others would be of Chinese, or they would be Hindus. So Indonesia, as you've seen in the geographical location, is really very close to the Philippines. In fact, the Bahasa Indonesia language is very similar to our Tagalog, to our national language. So we have certain words that have the same meanings, or phonetically they may be the same, and they have a different meaning in Bahasa Indonesia. And finally, okay, before the pandemic hit, so again, I mentioned about the study in the community colleges. So what happened was that we undertook a 3-month program in Canada to research and on the models of the Canadian community colleges. So we were based in Victoria mostly because of the Comolson College there, but we went all around Canada to try to come out with what is the Canadian model as differentiated from the American model. So this was like before the pandemic hit. And last year was supposed to have been my Fulbright here in the United States. Of course, we had pandemic, but more than the pandemic, we had started in the Philippines the year with a bang, because in January we had a major volcanic eruption. So that threw all of our plans. We were wanting to have an Asia-Pacific initiative with East Asia in terms of exchanges. But again, all of that were canceled. And so now the Philippines, we haven't actually returned to school at all, and not even for this coming school year, because specifically for our particular university, the whole university has been converted into a COVID referral service area. One, because we have a teaching hospital on campus, a 100-bed pediatrics hospital that is now a COVID referral center where the most critically ill with COVID are being confined. And then we have a hotel training facility, but that's been converted to the accommodations of the medical personnel. And so, of course, it will not be possible for our students to return. So we're in that particular situation right now. So definitely one of the major areas that we were really looking at would be how to move forward with online classes and how to put forth the ICT infrastructure to support that kind of system. So I think from all of that, so again, I go back to like, why did we have the lecture tonight? It's Saturday, you know, we want to have a lecture on Saturday night. It's because I feel that as a Fulbright scholar, I would like to have this continued friendship, goodwill, and collaboration with the peoples of the United States of America and that of the Republic of the Philippines. And I think that's the whole vision of Senator Fulbright when he started this program 75 years ago. So, and the answer to that million-dollar question, because June 12 was actually the day when the first Philippine Republic declared its independence on June 12, 1898. So from the Spanish colonial government. But then Spanish-American War happened. So eventually there was a negotiations on the Treaty of Paris in the Versailles Palace in France. The Philippine negotiator was not allowed during the negotiations, and that's when it transpired that the Philippines was ceded to the United States for $20 million together with 2 other territories. And so eventually, even as we had our independence declared from the American colonial government in 1946, in 1962 we enacted a law moving the Independence Day celebration to June 12 in commemoration of the actual independence. So I think there's an aspiration for the Filipino people to have the right to self-determination, to really pursue our aspirations. And I think part of that is our continued interaction with the United States of America. So there's a lot that can be said about our shared history, but definitely there's a lot that we would like to share from the United States and back. So I hope that we can continue with our partnership now and in the future, and thank you very much for your time tonight. So I'm just gonna show you a little bit of, like, here is the galleon. So let's see that. Can we see that from the object? Okay, let's see what it's looking like. So this is a replica of the galleon. Yeah, right? And so it's made of seashells. I'm going to give this to Team Galleon, right? To the UTM team as a souvenir, right? And then you have here, for the Governor's School, of course, we have our shell concert, right? Yes. So they lost their head, and Dr. Melhorn's wife had to bring it back, right? I had to cross the ocean to bring it. So, and we'll give it to the Governor's School as your souvenir, right? Katie. And then, of course, I'll show you a little bit, like, you know, what I was saying about how beautiful the Philippines is. So here's some, and I will give this as souvenirs to our scholars and counselors. So again, coconut trees, white sand beaches, hot weather. Okay, January, it's calling. Right? Yes. Should I turn it on like this? Okay. So that's one. And then here, it's like the smallest monkey in the world. Yeah, so it's in the Philippines. How cute, right? So it's in a specific island, and I'm going to give some souvenirs to our counselors and scholars of this tarsier monkey, right? And then here, we talked about the atolls, right? And the islands and the archipelago. So this is like how it might look like. So you have like the atoll. So it's like the corals and the sea water that's around it. Okay. We also have the underground river. So I told you that where my school is located is beside the river. So there's actually like a reclaimed area, a park that we have in our school, which is actually the river underneath it. So it's never far away from the water. And then again, islands are never far away from us, everywhere. So these are like the Philippine Islands. So when we were discovered, we were always known as the Philippine Islands, named after King Felipe of Spain. And here are some others. Okay, when we talk about like those, there's another one. This is a Muslim-inspired boat called the Vinta. So this would be more in the southern part of the Philippines. They would have that. And this is Manila. Okay, big city lights, right? And we have the oldest Chinatown in Asia, in the Philippines. As I said, the Chinese were already trading with the Filipinos before the Spaniards came. And of course, the symbol of Roman Catholicism, churches everywhere, Roman Catholic churches in the smallest towns in the Philippines. Okay. Okay. So, again, thank you so much for your time, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.